For the women who carry empires in their silence. For the men who burn cities to protect what they love. Naples does not forget. She only pretends to. The dress was black, because everything in the Esposito household had been black for the better part of a decade. Julia stood before the full-length mirror in what had once been her mother's dressing room, watching the woman in the glass with the detached curiosity of someone observing a stranger. The gown had been delivered that morning, without a note, without a card, only the Vitelli family's trademark, a single white lily tucked inside the tissue paper, petals already beginning to brown at the edges. She had not asked who chose it. She had not asked anything. Asking questions in Naples, she had learned young, was the fastest way to receive answers you couldn't unknow. The dress fit perfectly. That, more than anything, disturbed her. "You look like your mother." She did not turn. She had heard her Uncle Enzo shuffle in. He moved differently now, since the stroke had taken half the feeling from his right side. She watched his reflection instead, the way his eyes moved over her, with something she'd learned to read as guilt. "My mother is dead," she said. "Yes." He settled into the chair by the window, the one with the cracked leather arm that no one had ever bothered to replace. Outside, the Neapolitan afternoon was performing its usual drama. Vendors shouting, a child crying, a moped engine screaming up the Via Tribunali like a man fleeing his conscience. But the resemblance, Uncle. She said it gently, but with finality. Don't. He was quiet. Through the window, the ancient city pressed close. The Spanish Quarter's laundry strung between balconies like prayer flags. The faded saints painted on building corners, watching over street corners where other kinds of transactions occurred. Naples had always been a city of two worlds, layered so tightly over each other that you could never quite tell where the sacred ended and the profane began. The Esposito family had spent 3 generations learning to live in that overlap. Now there was only Julia, and somewhere across an ocean she had paid to put between them, her brother. She reached up and pressed her fingertips to the mirror's surface, feeling the cold glass against her skin. 28 years old, she thought. 28 years old, and she was about to walk into a room full of wolves and offer herself as collateral. No, not collateral. She corrected herself, as she had been correcting herself for 3 weeks now, ever since the Vitelli men had come to the Esposito estate and laid out their terms with the practiced pleasantness of men who had never needed to raise their voices to be obeyed. Not collateral, a bridge, a merger, a consolidation of assets, the asset being her. "He's not a cruel man," Enzo said, and she understood that he was trying. "You've never met him." "I've heard. You've heard what everyone hears." She turned from the mirror at last, picking up the small earrings, her grandmother's garnets, the only jewellery she'd kept, and working the clasps with steady hands. "That he's brilliant, that he's ruthless, that he has never in his life shown weakness to anyone." She paused. "Those aren't reassurances, Enzo. Those are warnings." Her uncle looked at his hands. "The family needs this." "I know." "The debts, since your father." "I know." The second time, quieter, final. She did know. She had been the one managing the Esposito accounts for the past 4 years, ever since her father's death had left a 31-year-old empire with a 24-year-old heir and enough debt to bury them all twice over. She had restructured, liquidated, manoeuvred. She had called in favours and sold properties and made the kind of cold calculations that had aged her faster than anything else. She had kept the name alive, if barely. She had kept her brother alive, which was the only thing that actually mattered. And now she was going to marry Marco Vitelli's second son, because the alternative was watching everything collapse. And because Luca, her brother, needed more time. She needed to give him more time. "I'll be ready in 10 minutes, she told her uncle, and her voice was entirely steady, and she hated herself for how much she'd practiced that. The dinner was held at Palazzo Reale, or rather in a private room adjacent to it that the Vitelli family had, over decades, made effectively their own. The city's ancient institutions had a way of accommodating the families that had quietly funded their renovations, and the Vitellis had always been generous patrons of Neapolitan culture, which was to say they had always been very good at making their power look like philanthropy. Giulia arrived with her uncle and her cousin Raffaele, who was 22 and terrified and trying not to show it, which was endearing in the way that very young courage always was. The Vitelli contingent was already assembled when they entered. Marco Vitelli himself, patriarch and architect of 3 decades of dominance in the south, silver-haired and elegant in the way that very old predators sometimes were. Several men she recognized from photographs and rumour. 2 women she didn't recognize at all, which told her they were dangerous. And at the far end of the room, with his back to her, looking out through the tall windows at the lights of the bay, Alessandro. She had studied what photographs existed. There were fewer than she expected for a man of his position, which itself told her something. You did not accumulate so little documented presence by accident. You cultivated it, the way you cultivated absence in a room, so that your arrival would be felt more acutely. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she had expected, something harder, perhaps, something that wore power the way men sometimes did, like armour bolted on for display. When he turned, she understood why the photographs had failed her. Alessandro Vitelli was 34 years old, and he was, the word that came to her mind, unwillingly, was precise. Not handsome in any conventional way, though he was that too, tall, dark-suited, with the kind of jaw that photographers loved and accountants feared. But it was the precision that struck her, the economy of his movements as he turned from the window, the way his eyes found her before she had fully entered the room, as though he had known exactly where to look and for how long. Dark eyes, still as water that has no bottom. "Signorina Esposito," his father said, crossing to greet her. She shook Marco Vitelli's hand. She said the appropriate things. She accepted a glass of something pale and cold that she had no intention of drinking. She navigated the room with the sociability she'd had to learn, had never been born with, and she felt Alessandro Vitelli's gaze on her the entire time, steady and unhurried and absolutely unreadable. The way a man might watch something that already belonged to him. She didn't look at him until she had to. When she finally did, when the dinner seating arranged it so that they were placed adjacent and there was no further social grace to be performed, She looked at him directly. She had decided on the way over that she would not perform nervousness. If she was afraid, and she was, a cold, rational fear that lived behind her sternum like a splinter, she would not show him. He was looking at her with that same quality of attention, not appraising, not the way men sometimes looked at her, something more careful, more considered. "You're not what I was told to expect," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the Neapolitan cadence softened by— she couldn't place it. Time spent elsewhere, she thought. Deliberately cultivated distance from his origins, or an earned cosmopolitanism. "What were you told?" she asked. "That you were practical, controlled, that you've managed your family's holdings with unusual competence for someone your age." A pause. "It was meant as praise." "It sounds like an assessment." The corner of his mouth moved. She wouldn't call it a smile. "Is there a difference?" "Usually," she said, "yes." He looked at her for a moment longer, that still, depthless look, and then he lifted his wineglass and turned to answer something his father was saying, and Julia sat very straight in her chair and reminded herself that she was the last Esposito standing, and last was not the same as alone, and she had already survived things that would have undone most people, and she could survive this too. She told herself all of this. She almost believed it. There was a particular light that came to Naples at dusk, just after the sun dropped behind Vesuvius and before the streetlights stuttered on. The ancient buildings caught it in their yellow stone and held it, glowing from within like embers, and the whole city looked briefly like something preserved in amber, beautiful and frozen and slightly unreal. Julia had loved that light since childhood. It was one of the few things about Naples she had never wanted to leave behind. She sat by the window of the Esposito Estate's library the morning after the dinner, with a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside her, and a leather-bound ledger open in her lap that she wasn't reading. The date was set. 6 weeks from now, she would become Giulia Vitelli. She had signed the initial agreements last night with the careful cursive she used for everything official. The signature she'd practiced at 16 when she understood that her father's handwriting was already beginning to shake. She was thinking about the box. The box lived in the concealed room behind the bookshelf in her father's old office, now her office, and it contained the thing that the Esposito family had, across 40 years, accumulated as their most private insurance policy. Ledgers, in the old sense, not financial ones. Names, dates, locations. The careful documentation of where the Vitelli organization and 2 other families, whose power stretched across the Campania region, had buried what they needed buried, both figuratively and otherwise. Her grandfather had started the collection in 1981, with the calm practicality of a man who understood that in Naples, knowledge was the only currency that never devalued. Her father had maintained it, and now it was hers. She had never intended to use it. It was insurance, not a weapon. The distinction mattered to her, philosophically, though she understood the line was thinner than she liked. But it existed, and Marco Vitelli didn't know it existed, and Alessandro Vitelli, about whom she had spent the last 12 hours failing to think clearly, almost certainly didn't know either, because if he had, the dinner last night would have looked very different. She brought the coffee cup to her lips. It was cold. She drank it anyway. The problem she was turning over in her mind was not the box itself. The problem was the third name in the most recent ledger additions, the entry her father had made 8 months before his death, in the cramped handwriting of a man who was already not well. Alessandro Vitelli, Reggio Incident, March 2019. Full account enclosed. She hadn't read the full account. She had opened the sealed envelope, seen the photographs, and closed it again. Some things, she had decided, you kept for emergencies. Some things you didn't let yourself know, because knowledge in Naples had a way of becoming visible on your face. She was marrying the man in those photographs in 6 weeks. She finished the cold coffee and opened the ledger in her lap, because there was always work to do, and Giulia Esposito had learned young that work was the cleanest medicine for the particular kind of fear that had no cure. Alessandro Vitelli's apartment occupied the top 2 floors of a building on the Posillipo hillside that had been built in the 1920s by an architect who had been, in equal measure, a genius and a criminal. Alessandro had bought the building 15 years ago, gutted it, and rebuilt the interior so thoroughly that the only things remaining from the original were the external walls, the marble staircase, and the view. The view was worth keeping. From the upper floor windows, the entire Bay of Naples lay spread below like a lover's confession. Vesuvius's silhouette against the east, Capri a pale shape in the afternoon haze, the city clinging to its slopes like something that couldn't decide whether to slide into the water or climb toward heaven. Alessandro stood at the window with a phone to his ear, listening to Carmine, his operations head, run through the week's logistics with the thorough cheerlessness of a man who was very good at his job and found very little pleasure in it. "The Salerno situation is resolved," Carmine said. "Good. The Esposito estate transfer documentation will be ready for signature by Thursday." "Fine. And Ferraro called. He wants a meeting about the port." "Tell him next month." A pause. "He won't like that. He doesn't have to like it." Alessandro's gaze was fixed on the middle distance, somewhere between the city and the sea. "Schedule the meeting for next month. Tell him I'm travelling." He wasn't travelling. He would be, 6 weeks from now, spending what his father cheerfully called a honeymoon at the family property in Amalfi. Alessandro had not corrected his father's cheerfulness. There had seemed to be no point in it. He set the phone down and thought about the woman he had met last night. He had been thinking about her, with the disciplined precision he brought to problems that mattered, for considerably longer than last night. In fact, he had been, in various ways, thinking about Giulia Esposito for approximately 2 years, which was as long as he had been monitoring the Esposito family's slow deterioration with the intention of eventually absorbing their remaining assets and territory. The monitoring had been professional. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that it had evolved. He had her dossier. He had reviewed it so many times he could have recited it. Born 1996, educated at the Università Federico II, literature. Returned to Naples at 22 to manage the family business when her father's health began to fail. Managed it with a competence that had surprised his analysts, who had initially projected total collapse within 18 months and kept having to revise their timelines. Twice she'd outmaneuvered creditors who should have had her buried. Once she'd negotiated a territorial concession with the Russo family that his own people had rated as nearly impossible. Intelligent, disciplined, isolated, in the way that people who carry too much tend to become isolated. Not because they lack warmth, but because warmth requires vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford. He knew about the brother. He had known about Luca Esposito for 18 months, had known he'd fled to Lisbon after a debt complication with the Ferraro people, had known exactly where he was and exactly why Giulia had engineered his disappearance so carefully. He knew, because knowing was what Alessandro Vitelli did. He assembled information the way other men assembled wealth, systematically, comprehensively, and with a long view toward utility. He had left the boy alone. He had, in fact, twice arranged, through 3 removes of intermediary untraceable back to him, for complications in the boy's trail to be quietly resolved. Not for sentimentality. He did not traffic in sentimentality. He had done it because disrupting the sister's ability to protect her brother would have disrupted her in ways that Alessandro, for reasons he hadn't fully examined, found himself unwilling to permit. She had looked at him last night with those dark, careful eyes, and she had been performing composure the way someone performs composure who has had to practice it into their bones. And something in him had recognized it with unsettling acuity, because he had been performing composure since he was 19 years old, and it had cost him nearly everything soft in him, and he understood exactly what it looked like and what it cost. He turned from the window. He had 6 weeks before the wedding. 6 weeks in which they would attend the requisite number of social functions together, in which Naples would watch the Vitelli-Esposito alliance solidify with the knowing attention of a city that ran on the currency of alliances. 6 weeks in which he needed to be careful. He was always careful. He crossed to his desk and opened the drawer and removed a small envelope that he had sealed 3 days ago before the dinner. Inside was a note he had written twice, the first draft discarded because the language had been wrong, too cold, too transactional. The second draft was 12 words long. He set the envelope on his desk and looked at it. The book had been ordered from a specialist dealer in Florence 6 months ago, first edition, 1958. Il Gatto Pardo, the leopard. He had read in a profile of the Esposito family published in a cultural magazine 11 years ago, a profile that had focused on Giulia's grandfather, but had mentioned in passing that his granddaughter had read Lampedusa's novel at 12 and been profoundly altered by it. This detail, and he had noted it and filed it and eventually understood what he intended to do with it. He was not a man who acted on impulse, but he was occasionally a man who acted on certainty. The cafe where they met for the first time alone was Giulia's choice. She had suggested it because she knew it, the owner, the layout, the 2 exits, the table in the back left corner where the sight lines were good. You learned these things by habit, or you learned them by loss, and Giulia had done the necessary learning. He arrived 2 minutes before their agreed time, which told her something. Men who arrived early to meetings were either anxious or controlling, and she already knew enough about Alessandro Vitelli to rule out the former. He sat across from her without ceremony, without the social performance of pleasantry, and ordered an espresso from the young waiter who materialized at his shoulder with the alacrity that certain kinds of presence commanded. "I wanted to speak with you privately," he said, "before the arrangements become formal." "They're already fairly formal," she said. "We signed papers last night." "The papers are administrative." He picked up the small spoon and turned it between his fingers once, a gesture she would come to recognize as his version of pausing. "I meant formal in the sense that becomes difficult to navigate honestly." She looked at him. "Are you warning me that honesty has a narrow window?" the corner of his mouth, that movement again, not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. I'm suggesting we use it while it's available. The espresso arrived. He didn't touch it. He was watching her in that precise, still way, and she made the decision to match it, to sit with her hands loose on the table and her eyes level, and not to fill the silence with performance. "What would you like to be honest about?" she asked. "This arrangement suits me professionally," he said. "The Esposito territories consolidate our southern access, and the alliance resolves 3 ongoing jurisdictional frictions with a solution that costs us less than the alternative. These are the reasons my father agreed to it." "And your reasons?" A pause longer than the others. She noticed it. "I agreed to it for reasons I'd rather not enumerate in a cafe." He said it without defensiveness, matter-of-factly, as though he were noting a logistical constraint rather than revealing something. "But I want to be clear about something, about what I intend." "Go on." "I intend this to be real," he said, "not a performance. I'm aware that isn't what you agreed to, and I'm aware that you have limited reason to trust my judgment on what real means in this context. But I want you to know it." She sat with that for a moment. Around them, the cafe performed its afternoon rituals, the hiss of the machine, 2 old men arguing about football at the counter, the particular smell of Naples coffee that was different from everywhere else, stronger and darker, like the city itself. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you're going to discover things about me over time," he said. "And I'd rather you begin with the context that my intentions toward you are not hostile." He paused. "Even if what you discover is complicated." She heard it, the qualifier, the acknowledgement that there were things to discover. "Are you warning me?" she asked. "Yes." "About what, specifically?" He looked at her steadily. "About the kind of man I am, which is to say, I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you that I intend to give you every reason I'm capable of giving you to trust me, over time, and that the process will probably be slower than you'd like and less transparent than you deserve, and I understand if that's insufficient." Julia put her coffee cup down. She thought about the box behind the bookshelf. She thought about Luca in Lisbon, in a small apartment she sent money to through 3 different accounts. She thought about her mother's face, which she remembered only in photographs now, and her father's hands, which she remembered perfectly. "I have conditions," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. She was beginning to think he didn't do surprise in any conventional way. More like attention sharpening, like a dial being turned to a finer frequency. "Tell me," he said. "My uncle stays in the estate. That's non-negotiable. The property passes to the Vitelli holdings administratively, but Enzo stays in his rooms until he dies." "Agreed." "My cousin Raffaele keeps his current position with the family business operations. He doesn't get absorbed into your structure and disappeared." "Agreed." She held his gaze. "And the people who work for the Esposito household, the domestic staff, the groundskeepers, they retain their positions and their wages for a minimum of 2 years." "Agreed." She had expected negotiation. The immediate agreement was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and she'd been around powerful men long enough to know the difference was sometimes invisible until it was too late. "You agreed very quickly," she said. "They're reasonable conditions." He finally picked up his espresso and drank. "I would have agreed to more demanding ones." "Why?" He set the cup down. Because you asked carefully. Because everything you asked for was for other people. He paused, and something in the pause was different from the others, heavier perhaps, or more deliberate. You didn't ask for anything for yourself. She opened her mouth and closed it. That's noted, he said, not unkindly, not as a criticism. She felt something she didn't have a name for move through her chest, not warmth exactly, and not the cold she'd been carrying for 4 years, but something in between, something that was trying to become something, and she didn't know yet what to do with it. "I have one more condition," she said. "Tell me." "I want complete honesty about your business operations. Not details. I'm not asking to be read into your operational security. But I want to know if something I do, or something associated with the Esposito name, is being used in a way I haven't agreed to." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a more complicated thing to promise." "I know." "But I'll promise it," he said, "on the condition that you extend me the same." She felt the sentence land. She thought about the box. She thought about Luca. "That's also complicated," she said carefully. "I know." His voice was even. His eyes were still. "I'm not asking you to show me everything tonight. I'm asking you to keep the option open." It was the most accurate thing she could imagine him saying, and the fact that it was accurate unsettled her in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Keep the option open," she repeated. "Yes." She picked up her coffee. It had gone slightly cold. She drank it anyway. She had a habit of finishing cold coffee that she'd never bothered to interrogate. "All right," she said. Outside, Naples went about its ancient, chaotic business. Inside the cafe, something had begun that neither of them had quite named yet, and the naming of it, Julia suspected, would be the most dangerous thing of all. She first noticed it on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the wedding. She was walking back from a meeting with her uncle's lawyer on the Via Duomo, a meeting that had involved 63 minutes of documentation, 2 cups of terrible coffee, and the quiet finality of signing over the last of the Esposito properties, when she became aware of the car. Black, mid-range sedan, the kind that was designed to disappear into traffic. It had been behind her since she left the office building, keeping a distance that was professionally calibrated, not so close as to alarm, not so far as to lose her. She walked another block without changing her pace, crossed the street. The car adjusted. She went into a pharmacy, bought nothing, emerged from the side exit, and took a circling route through the Spaccanapoli district that added 11 minutes to her walk home. The car didn't follow her through the side exit, but when she emerged onto the Via Benedetto Croce, a different car, same colour, different plates, was maintaining the same calibrated distance. She arrived home with her pulse steady and her mind arranging the possibilities with the cold efficiency she developed out of necessity. She sat in her father's chair and turned it over carefully. Either Alessandro Vitelli was having her followed, or someone else was. She called him. He answered on the second ring, which she filed away as a data point. "There are 2 of your people behind me," she said, without preamble. "Or someone else's people. I'm giving you the opportunity to clarify before I draw my own conclusions." A silence of approximately 3 seconds. "Mine," he said. She had expected denial. The absence of it reorganized something in her thinking. How long? 6 months. She processed this. Before the arrangement was proposed? Yes. Why? Because I needed to understand the Esposito situation thoroughly before making any approach. And the situation included you. A pause. And because the Ferraro family has had interest in your remaining assets for the same period, and I wanted to know if they were pressing that interest in ways that required my attention. Were they? Twice, he said. Both times resolved before they required your attention? She sat very still. You intervened in something involving me without telling me. Yes. You don't see that as a problem. I see it as a decision I made for reasons I was prepared to defend, he said, and which I am now defending. The surveillance will end when you ask me to end it, or when the threat from the Ferraro side is sufficiently resolved that it's no longer necessary. And you think those are the only two conditions that apply? The briefest pause. No, he said. I also think you deserve to decide for yourself. Another pause. Which is why I'm telling you now, when you asked, instead of denying it. She pressed her thumb against the arm of the chair, feeling the carved edge of the wood. Her grandfather's chair, old and solid and very particular in its presence. I want a name, she said. Whoever is coordinating the detail. I want a name and a direct line. And if I tell them to stand down, they stand down immediately. Done. And I want to know if the threat from Ferraro escalates immediately, not after you've resolved it. A silence. Longer this time. That's more difficult for me. I'm aware. Not because I'm unwilling, he said, and the carefulness in his voice was evident enough that she believed it. Because my instinct is to resolve things before they reach you, and that instinct is— He stopped. Is what? Strong, he said, and then, quietly, I'll work on it. She didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't what she had expected, not from a man described in 3 cities as devoid of weakness. She had expected a negotiation, not a concession. She had expected management, not acknowledgement. Send me the name tonight, she said, and hung up. She sat in the chair for another 20 minutes, watching the fading light on the wall, listening to the city outside. Then she opened the ledger on the desk and began to work, because work was what she did when things were complicated, and things were becoming very complicated. The name he sent was Ricci, 41 years old, former carabinieri, now employed in a private capacity. Julia looked the name up in 3 databases she wasn't supposed to have access to, found nothing alarming, and filed it. Then she called her contact at the notary's office and asked, very carefully, about a property in Lisbon. The answer reassured her. The arrangement was holding, the money was arriving, and Luca was, as far as the contact knew, safe and well, and enrolled, of all things, in a language course. Portuguese, she thought, and something that was almost a smile moved through her. Of course he was learning Portuguese. He had always had his father's facility for languages and his mother's facility for surviving things that should have killed him. He was 23 years old, and he was alive, and he was learning Portuguese in a city that didn't know his name, and Julia had bought that with 4 years of herself, and she would buy more of herself still if that was the price. The wedding was in 3 weeks. She opened the ledger and got to work. Alessandro's office was on the 14th floor of a building that didn't have his name on it anywhere. He stood at his window. He spent a great deal of time at windows, a habit he had developed as a child, when standing at windows was the only way to be in a room and appear not to be paying attention while paying absolute attention, and thought about the phone call. She had been calm. That was the thing that marked her, he thought, the quality of her calm. It wasn't the practiced surface calm of someone performing. It was the structural calm of someone who had been afraid so many times that the architecture of their fear had become load-bearing. You needed it the way a building needed its columns. You didn't perform it. You lived inside it. He had expected her to be angry. She had been precise instead, and precision, in Alessandro's experience, was significantly more effective than anger. He had told Carmine to send Richie's name and contact information within the hour. He had then sat down at his desk and spent 20 minutes doing something he almost never did, which was examining his own motivations with the unsparing attention he normally reserved for his enemy's weaknesses. The surveillance had begun as intelligence gathering. He was honest enough with himself about that. He had needed to understand the Esposito holdings, the Esposito debts, the Esposito liabilities. He had needed to understand her. But somewhere in the 6 months of Richie's reports, the photographs, the movement logs, the behavioral analysis that Richie was professional enough to compile, but too experienced to interpret, it had become something else. He had found himself reading the reports at midnight instead of delegating them. He had found himself noting things that had no operational utility. That she walked faster when it was cold. That she spent 40 minutes every Sunday morning in the second-hand bookshop on the Via Portalba. That she always chose a table with her back to the wall. That she carried herself with the particular uprightness of someone who had decided at some point that posture was one of the few things nobody could take from you. He had found himself making decisions, like the 2 interventions with the Ferraro people, that were not purely strategic. He was not a man who permitted himself the luxury of self-deception, which meant he had known for some time exactly what this was. He just wasn't sure yet what he intended to do about it. Other than marry her in 3 weeks, which was already arranged. The book arrived on a Monday. It was delivered by hand, not by a courier, but by a young man Julia didn't recognize, who came to the estate's front door and asked for her specifically. No company name, no return address, just a box, plain and brown, tied with dark ribbon, addressed in handwriting she hadn't seen before, but somehow recognized as deliberate, the careful, precise penmanship of someone who normally did everything by phone and had chosen for this to write. She brought it upstairs to the library and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment before opening it. Inside the tissue paper, the white lily, already browning. She had expected this. She hadn't expected the book. Il Gattopardo, the leopard. A first edition, she realized, handling it with the instinctive care of someone who had grown up around old things. The 1958 Feltrinelli, the typeface she had seen only in photographs of the original printing, the paper slightly foxed with age, but intact, beautifully intact, smelling of that specific dry warmth that old books had. She had never told anyone that this was her favourite novel, She had mentioned it, perhaps in passing, once to a professor at university, once in a written assignment she hadn't kept. She had not broadcast it. It was not on any social media profile she maintained, which was minimal. It was not in any interview she'd given to the cultural press, the single one 2 years ago, when a journalist had written a piece about young women in traditional Neapolitan business families. She sat down. She turned the book over in her hands with the methodical attention of someone looking for something they aren't sure they want to find. The envelope was tucked inside the front cover, small, cream-coloured, sealed. She opened it. The note inside was small, the same careful handwriting, unsigned. He's safe. He will always be safe. This is the only promise I make to you, without any conditions attached. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table beside the book and pressed her palms flat on the surface of the table and held very still. He's safe. He, not she. Not your family is protected or your remaining obligations are secure. He, singular, specific. Her brother, who she had never mentioned, whose existence she had carefully, systematically erased from every conversation about the Esposito family situation, whose name did not appear in any of the documentation she had signed with the Vitelli representatives, whose location she had spent 18 months and considerable money obscuring from exactly the kind of intelligence operation that Alessandro Vitelli ran as a matter of course. He knew. She sat with this for a long time. Outside, the afternoon light was doing its amber thing to the buildings, and the city was making its constant music, and she sat very still at the table, with her palms flat, and her mind moving through the implications with the systematic thoroughness that was, at this point, more reflex than effort. He knew about Luca. He had known for how long? The note said he will always be safe. Not I will ensure, not I have arranged, will always be. Present continuous certainty, the language of someone who had already made the decision and was reporting it rather than promising a future action. He'd been keeping Luca safe. She thought about the 2 Ferraro interventions he'd mentioned on the phone. She had assumed they were related to her, to the Esposito properties, to the business calculus of protecting an asset he intended to acquire. She had filed them under professional self-interest. She rearranged that filing now. She picked up the note and read it a 3rd time, without any conditions attached. This, more than anything, was the thing she kept returning to. Because in her experience, in the experience of anyone who had grown up adjacent to power, nothing was given without conditions. The conditions might be explicit or implicit, immediate or deferred, transactional or emotional, but they existed. They were the grammar of every exchange in the world she inhabited. He was telling her this was different. She didn't know if she believed him. She knew, with a certainty that lived in her body rather than her mind, that the note was true, that Luca was safe, that he had been made safe deliberately by someone who could have used the boy as leverage and had chosen not to. That choice, the restraint of it, the decision to protect when exploit was an available option, was the most frightening thing she had encountered in this entire arrangement, because it meant Alessandro Vitelli was not what she had organized her defenses against. He was something she didn't have a category for yet. She held the book in her hands for a long time. Then she placed it carefully on the shelf, beside her father's copy of the same novel, a worn paperback, broken-spined from readings, and she put the note in her pocket, close to her body, and she went to the window and looked at Naples, doing its complicated evening things. She did not call him. She needed to think first. She needed to understand what it meant that a man she was about to marry had, without announcement or expectation of credit, protected the one person she would have sacrificed everything to protect. What it meant. What she was supposed to do with it. She touched the note through the fabric of her pocket. Outside, Vesuvius brooded in the dusk, and Naples burned gold, and the bay caught the last of the light and held it, the way the sea always holds what the land eventually releases. The pre-wedding social calendar, as orchestrated by Marco Vitelli's wife Ornella and conducted across a series of dinners, gallery openings, and one charity gala that Julia found more exhausting than any business meeting, was essentially an extended performance of family unity for the benefit of Naples's interwoven social and criminal aristocracy. Julia performed it with a precision she had had to learn from scratch, because the Esposito women had, historically, not been much for performance. Her grandmother had been famously direct. Her mother had been famously private. She was working on it. At each event, Alessandro was present. At each event, he was positioned near her, not hovering, which would have been suffocating, and not distant, which would have read badly to the room, but near, available, alert in the way she was beginning to recognize as simply how he moved through the world, with his attention distributed the way a general distributed troops, with most of it on perimeter, but a substantial portion always on her. She noticed because she was noticing. She admitted to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, paying attention to him in a way that was becoming inconvenient. He had excellent hands. This was a ridiculous thing to observe, and she noted it only because she caught herself noticing it at the gala, when he accepted a drink from a passing tray, and she watched his fingers close around the glass with an unhurried certainty that was characteristic of everything he did. He moved through expensive rooms the way he moved through everything else, as though the room had been arranged for his comfort, not because he was arrogant, but because he was so thoroughly himself that environments seemed to accommodate him by default. He was also, she had begun to notice, funny. Not in any obvious way, not charming funny, the social performance of wit that men in his position sometimes deployed, but occasionally, in the intervals between official conversation, he would say something low and dry and perfectly observed that caught her off guard, and she would feel the almost laugh rise in her chest before she'd made the decision to permit it. Ornella has decided that we're the love story of the decade, he said at the gallery opening, standing beside her in front of a painting she'd already assessed as technically skilled and emotionally empty. She's been telling Dottoressa Marchetti this for the past 10 minutes. Julia glanced sideways. His expression was perfectly composed. His eyes contained something that might, in a different face, have been called amusement. "What did you tell her?" Julia asked. "I didn't need to tell her anything," he said. "She's creating the story she wants." He paused. "She's good at that. Your mother seems to love you very much." "She does." Something shifted in his voice, very slightly. "And she worries about me, which she's been doing since 1993, and which I've entirely failed to cure her of." 1993, she said. "How old were you?" 9. His voice was even, informative. My father's position became public that year. There were threats against the family. She worried. She thought about a 9-year-old boy learning what his family was, learning to understand that the thing that protected you could also destroy you, learning that love and danger were not opposite things, but nested ones. She didn't ask anything further. He hadn't offered it as an invitation exactly, more as a piece of himself placed visible, to be acknowledged or not. She acknowledged it by not looking away. My brother was 8 when my father explained what the Esposito name meant, she said quietly. Not looking at the painting, not looking at Alessandro, just looking at the middle distance where the gallery's warm light dissolved into shadow. He cried. I didn't. Did that bother you? He asked. Not crying. Yes, she said. For years. She paused. I've come to terms with it. He made the sound the way he made all sounds, considered, unhurried. I never cried in front of anyone after I was 11. I'm not sure that was coming to terms with anything. She looked at him then. He was looking at the painting, his profile clean against the gallery light. What was it instead? She asked. Adaptation, he said, which isn't the same thing. They stood in front of the empty painting for another minute, and the party revolved around them, and Ornella Vitelli watched them from across the room with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had arranged something she believed was beautiful. It was at the third dinner, a Tuesday evening at a villa in Portici, with 12 people, including 2 members of the regional government, who were present for reasons everyone understood and no one mentioned, that Julia first saw the other side of him. Not the side she'd been building her careful assessments of, the other side, the one she'd known existed in the abstract, intellectually, but had not yet encountered in person. A man named Sorrentino, affiliated with one of the regional families, mid-level, the kind of man who was important enough to be invited to things, but not important enough to be listened to, had too much wine, and began talking about the Esposito name with the historical revisionism of the slightly drunk and the casually cruel. He wasn't saying anything outright, he was just revising. Gently, in the way of a man who thought that because the family's fortunes had fallen, the family's worth had fallen proportionally. Mentioning debts, economic difficulties, restructuring, with the studied casualness of cruelty that mistakes itself for conversation. Julia had been managing this kind of thing for 4 years. She knew how to sit through it. She had not yet seen how Alessandro Vitelli managed it. She didn't see him move. That was the thing. One moment he was at the other end of the table, and then he was beside her, and his hand was on the table near hers, not touching, just present. And he said something to Sorrentino very quietly that she couldn't hear from her position. But she saw Sorrentino's face. The colour left it, in a way she had seen before on the faces of men who suddenly understood exactly where they stood and that they had misjudged the distance. Whatever Alessandro said took approximately 15 seconds. Then he returned his attention to the table, to the dinner, to the conversation, with absolute normality, and Sorrentino spent the remaining 40 minutes of dinner sitting very quietly and excusing himself immediately after dessert. Alessandro did not look at her during any of this. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not reference the incident in any way. After dinner, In the hallway, while coats were being retrieved, she caught his eye. "Thank you," she said. "You had it managed," he said quietly. "I did." She held his gaze. "You did it anyway." A pause, something in his expression that she was beginning to read, an acknowledgement he wasn't comfortable making in words. "Yes," he said. She accepted her coat from the attendant and walked into the Naples evening, and her heart was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. And she walked faster, and the night air was cold and smelled of the sea, and she thought, 6 weeks ago, I was marrying a strategic acquisition. She did not finish the thought. The ceremony was held at Santa Chiara because the Vitellis had been married at Santa Chiara for 4 generations, and this was not a family that broke with its own mythology. It was a Tuesday in late October, which Alessandro had chosen and which Giulia had not questioned, and the church's courtyard, the cloister with its tiled columns, and the hanging garden, and the particular quality of autumn light that made Naples look like a painting of itself, was full of people watching 2 people become something. She walked the aisle alone, which she had asked for. Her uncle had offered. She had thanked him and declined. The Esposito women came to things on their own terms, and this, whatever this was, she would come to on her own. Alessandro was waiting at the altar with the stillness she had come to associate with him, the quality of presence that occupied space without demanding it. He wore dark grey, impeccably, and when she came to stand beside him and he turned to look at her, his face was not blank, not performed. Something in it was very still and very careful, and very close to what she thought, without letting herself think it too clearly, might be called moved. She did not look away from him. She had decided this, too. The words were said, the rings were exchanged. Hers, she noticed, was exactly her size, which should not have surprised her, and did. She wore it on her hand and felt its weight with a strangeness that was not entirely unpleasant, which was strange in itself. Afterward, in the photographic interval that these events required, she stood beside him in the courtyard with the October light on the tiles and his arm barely touching hers, and Naples pressed close on all sides, and she thought about Il Gattopardo, Lampedusa's great meditation on the price of continuity, the aristocrat watching his world transform and knowing that the only way to survive transformation was to become part of it. Everything must change so that everything can stay the same. She wasn't sure she agreed, but she understood for the first time what it felt like to be in the moment of change, looking at someone who was also in it, and not knowing yet what would be the same on the other side. He leaned close to say something to a guest, and his shoulder pressed briefly against hers, and she felt the solid reality of him, not abstract, not a dossier, not a strategic calculation, and made the small, private acknowledgement she'd been deferring. She was afraid of him. Not for her safety, not in the way she had been afraid walking into the first dinner. She was afraid in the way you were afraid of things that had the power to change you, the particular vertigo of standing at the edge of something that would alter the landscape of yourself permanently, and not knowing if you were about to step forward or fall. "Ready?" he said, low, just for her, while the photographer arranged something and everyone else arranged themselves. She looked at him. "For what specifically?" His mouth moved. "All of it," he said. She considered this. "Probably not," she said honestly. "You?" A pause. something in his eyes that she was starting to read as rare, unguarded. "No," he said. She felt something settle in her, not calm exactly, but adjacent to it, the particular kind of steadiness you found when you admitted the truth. The photographer called their positions, and they turned to face it, standing close enough to touch and not quite touching. And Naples stood witness, and the October light made everything golden, and the church had seen centuries of these arrangements, and remained, as it always did, entirely unmoved and entirely beautiful. The Vitelli property in Amalfi was built into the cliff face in a way that made it look less like a house than like an intention, terraced into the stone, facing directly south over the Mediterranean, with the kind of view that reminded you that the sea was not sentimental about anything. They arrived in the early afternoon. The house staff had been discreet enough to be invisible, the rooms were prepared, and Julia stood on the main terrace with the wind in her hair and the sea approximately 200 feet below, and felt the particular unreality of being somewhere beautiful with someone she didn't know how to think about yet. Alessandro had been quiet on the drive down, not uncomfortable quiet. The Vitelli driver had been present, and also Alessandro simply had the capacity to be quiet without it reading as withdrawal, which was unusual enough that she'd noted it. Twice during the 3-hour drive she'd caught him watching her in the window's reflection, and he'd met her eyes in the glass without looking away, without embarrassment, with the directness she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he was paying attention to. "Do you want the full tour, or would you rather have an hour first?" he said behind her now, coming to stand at the terrace railing not quite beside her. "An hour," she said. "I'll be in the study." She heard his footsteps withdraw. She stayed on the terrace. The Mediterranean was doing its autumn thing, pewter and restless, with white crests far out, and the sound of it reaching her faintly, carried on the wind. She thought about Luca, who had the sea in his blood the way all Neapolitans did, who had wanted to be a marine biologist at 12 and a musician at 15, and God knew what now at 23, learning Portuguese in a city built where a river met the ocean. He's safe. He will always be safe. She took the note from her inside pocket. She had been carrying it since Monday, and read it again. Her own name wasn't on it. His name wasn't on it. It existed in a strange, private space between them, undiscussed, unacknowledged in any conversation they'd had. She wondered if he was waiting for her to bring it up. She wondered if she was waiting for something she couldn't name. She put the note back in her pocket and went inside to find the room she'd been given, and to spend her allotted hour in the particular kind of productive solitude that was the only way she'd learned to think. Dinner that night was on the terrace, because the evening was mild enough and the view was extraordinary enough that the house required it. Simple food, the kind that a good kitchen produced when it wasn't trying, white fish and vegetables and bread that was still warm and wine that was the right kind of cold. They sat across from each other, with the sea behind him and the cliff behind her and the candles between them doing their flickering work. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said. She hadn't planned it. It arrived in the space between the fish and the bread with the directness of something that had been waiting. He looked at her. "Something specific? Something you haven't told anyone?" A long pause. He turned his wineglass once. "I read obsessively," he said. "Specifically history. I have an entire room in the apartment that I've never shown anyone because it looks—" He stopped. Obsessive, he finished, the same word, with a self-awareness that surprised her. What kind of history? Empires, he said, specifically their endings, how they end, what the people inside them understand about the ending as it's happening, and what they only understand after. He paused. It has some obvious relevance to my situation, which I'm aware of. Is that why you started? No. He was quiet for a moment. I started because my grandfather, the one who built the original Vitelli operations, used to tell me that every family was an empire, and every empire had a natural span, and that the intelligent man's job was not to extend the span, but to manage the ending well. He paused. He died badly. He didn't take his own advice. What happened? He refused to acknowledge when the world had changed, Alessandro said, without particular emotion. He kept operating as though the dynamics of the 1970s were still operative in 2004. They weren't. He picked up his wine. It killed him. She looked at him across the candles. And you? I intend to be more adaptable, the corner of his mouth, with varying success. Tell me something else, she said. He was quiet for a moment, considering, she thought, what to offer. Not performing candour, actually measuring it the way you measured medicine. Not too much, not too little. Enough. I find most people predictable, he said carefully, not in a contemptuous way. In the way that someone who studies something develops an eye for its patterns. I spend a great deal of time around people, and I'm rarely surprised. A pause. You surprised me. When? At the first dinner. He set his glass down. Every reaction I'd predicted was wrong. The composure. I'd expected composure. But not the quality of it, not the... He paused, and she had the impression of a man editing himself in real time, not out of evasion, but out of precision, looking for the word that was accurate rather than the word that was available. Not the particularity of it, he finished. You were scared, but you were entirely yourself inside the fear. I hadn't anticipated that. She was quiet for a moment. I was practicing it for 6 weeks, she said. I know. His eyes were steady on hers. That's what I mean. The candles moved in the sea wind. The Mediterranean shifted colours in the dark, going from pewter to something closer to black. Below the terrace, the sound of waves against the cliff came up faintly, rhythmic and implacable. Your turn, he said. She thought about what to offer, measured it the same way he had. I've never been afraid of the family business, she said. I've been afraid of the cost of it. The distinction took me years to understand. She paused. My father was afraid of the business itself, of what it made him. He tried to keep distance between himself and the decisions. It didn't work. I think the distance was worse for him than the proximity would have been. Why? Because you couldn't control what you were keeping at arm's length. She picked up her bread. He had no grip on it. It still ran him. He just couldn't see it clearly enough to run it back. She paused. I decided when I took over that I'd rather look at it directly. And? And it's still terrible, she said, but at least I understand what I'm managing. He looked at her for a long moment, the look that had no bottom. Yes, he said simply. That's exactly it. She reached for her wine and found that her hand was steadier than she'd expected, and something inside her chest was doing that between thing again, the thing that was trying to become something she hadn't named yet. And she let it, briefly, because the Amalfi Terrace was dark and the sea was close, and there was, in this moment, no one watching. 3 days into the Amalfi stay, it rained. Not the light Mediterranean rain that came and went with the politeness of a guest who knew when to leave, but a proper November storm that came in from the southwest with the full authority of a season asserting itself, that turned the sea to hammered lead and filled the house with the sound of water on stone and made the outside world provisional. Julia spent the morning with her laptop at the kitchen table. She had brought work, which Alessandro had not commented on, which she appreciated, and found she could concentrate adequately despite the persistent awareness that he was in the study, one room over, separated by a door that was not quite fully closed. By midday, the rain had intensified. She made coffee for two without quite deciding to, and appeared in the study doorway with both cups. He was at the desk, reading. Physical books. She noted that he read physical books the way she did, with a second open beside the first for something, cross-referencing or comparison, and he looked up without starting, as though he had known she was there. He probably had. "You made two," he said. "An accident," she said, which they both understood was not accurate. She sat on the window seat across from his desk because there was a window and she could watch the storm, and she set one cup on the edge of his desk and held the other and looked at the sea throwing itself at the cliff below. They worked in silence for approximately 40 minutes, which was one of the strangest and most comfortable things she had done in years. Then he said, without looking up from the page, "You're not going to ask me about the Reggio incident?" She went very still. He kept reading for another moment. Then he set the book down and looked at her. "I know about the documentation your family kept," he said. "I've known for a year." The room was very quiet, except for the rain. "How?" she asked. Her voice was even. She was proud of it. "An Esposito accountant. He was in debt to people who were in debt to me, and he sold information in pieces without understanding that the pieces, assembled, told me more than he intended." He paused. "He's no longer a problem." She held his gaze. "What does that mean?" "He's in Genoa. He's employed. He's well supervised." His voice was measured. "I didn't kill him. I want to be clear about that." She processed this. "You've known about the documentation for a year, including the Reggio entry?" "Yes." "And you proposed the marriage anyway?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive quiet, the kind of quiet that was weighing exactly how much truth to give. "Because the documentation changes nothing for me," he said, "in terms of what I intend." "It gives me leverage." "Yes." His voice was even, informative, significant leverage. "That doesn't concern you." "It would concern me," he said carefully, "if you were someone who used leverage indiscriminately. You're not." He paused. "I've been watching you for 6 months. You had leverage over Ferraro people twice in that period, the Gallo property dispute and the Corso situation, and you used neither. You sat on both and waited for resolution that didn't require escalation." She stared at him. "You had significant leverage over a council member in July," he continued, with the same even delivery. And you chose instead to route the solution through administrative channels that were slower and more expensive, but left no collateral exposure. A pause. You use leverage only when you have no other option. I concluded this. And that made you comfortable. That made me trust your judgment, he said. There's a difference. She stood up and walked to the window, because she needed the movement, and stood with her arms crossed, looking at the rain. Behind her, he was very still. The Reggio photographs, she said. Did you look at all of them? Yes. And? And the Reggio incident happened, he said, in the way that things happen in this life, in the life we both inhabit, and I live with it the way I live with other things I cannot undo. I don't ask you to accept it. I don't ask you to forgive it. I ask you to know it, which you already do. She turned from the window. He was sitting very straight in the desk chair with his hands resting flat on the desk, and his face was doing the open thing, the rare, unguarded thing. And she understood that this conversation was costing him something he didn't normally spend. Did you know, she said, when you started the arrangement, that I would eventually find out you knew about the documentation? I assumed it was likely, he said. This is not a small city, and eventually these things surface. So you weren't planning to use it? No. His voice was quiet. Use it how? Against you. You're my... He stopped. The word seemed to catch on something. He started again. You're not someone I intend to use anything against. She looked at him for a long moment. The note, she said, in the book. You wrote it yourself. Yes. You knew about Luca. Yes, for 18 months. And the 2 Ferraro interventions, both related to him, yes. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down without drinking. The Ferraro people had acquired his location during the first incident. I arranged to redirect their attention. She sat back down on the window seat. The rain was loud and steady and consistent, and somewhere below the cliff, the sea was doing something massive and impersonal. Why didn't you just tell me, she asked, any of this? Why the book and the unsigned note and the... Because I didn't want you to feel managed, he said. I wanted you to know that he was safe and that there were no conditions, but I didn't want it to come with the weight of, I know your secret, and I've been protecting it, and now you owe me the knowledge of it. That's a transaction. I didn't want it to be a transaction. She heard this. She sat with it. That's a very fine distinction, she said. Yes, he met her eyes. I'm told my distinctions are frequently too fine for practical purposes. By whom? The corner of his mouth. Carmine. Frequently. Something cracked in her chest, not broke, cracked, the way things crack when pressure is released rather than increased. She felt it like a physical thing, a seam giving. I have a condition, she said. Tell me. I want to talk to him, to Luca, through you, through your channels, through whatever routing you use that's secure. I want to be able to talk to him. He looked at her. I can have that arranged by tomorrow morning. Thank you. She paused. I've been communicating through intermediaries for 8 months. Not hearing his voice has been... She stopped. She hadn't intended to say that. He didn't react with the kind of immediate sympathy that would have felt like an intrusion. He just looked at her with that steady attention and nodded. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I promise." She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Luca's voice, when she heard it, was the same. That was the thing that broke her, privately, standing in the small room on the second floor while Alessandro waited downstairs by mutual, unspoken agreement. The voice was the same, 23 and fugitive in Lisbon and enrolled in a Portuguese language class, and her brother's voice was exactly the same as when he was 17 and calling her at midnight from a school trip to ask if she was all right, because he always asked if she was all right when he was the one away from home, which was the most Luca thing in the world. "Julia!" His voice on the secure line. Alessandro's people had set up the connection, had been professional and swift and entirely unremarked upon, as though facilitating impossible things was simply a logistics problem. "I've been so—" "I know," she said. "I know. I'm all right." "Are you really?" "Yes. Tell me the truth." "I'm telling you the truth." She sat down on the edge of the bed and looked out at the rain-grey sea. "I'm in Amalfi. I got married 6 days ago." A silence. "I know. Rosa called me." Rosa was their uncle's daughter, who had attended the wedding and was the only family member who knew how to reach Luca through the careful routing system. "How did you—" She said, "He looks like trouble," Luca said, and she could hear in the shape of the sentence that he was afraid and trying not to be afraid, and that the attempt to be brave took the form of humour, which was so like him she felt it in her sternum. "He is trouble," she said, "but not the kind I can't manage." "Julia." His voice went serious. The levity fell away. "You didn't have to—" "Don't," she said. "Don't do that. You did it for me. You did the whole— everything you've done for the past 4 years. You did it for me. And I've been sitting here in—" "Luca." Her voice was firm. "You're alive. That's the only accounting I need." A long pause. The rain outside. The sea. "Is he good to you?" her brother asked finally. She thought about the book, the note, the 2 Ferraro interventions, the conversation yesterday in the study with its careful accounting of truth, the way he'd said, "Use it against you," as though the concept were genuinely foreign to him, which he was beginning to believe it was. "He's surprising," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I have right now." Luca was quiet for a moment. Then, "Rosa said the wedding was—" He paused. "She said when you walked in, he didn't look at the church or the guests or anything else. Just you." She didn't say anything. "Julia, I heard you." "Is that—" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm still figuring out what things mean. Give me time." "You have time," he said, and his voice was gentler. "For the first time in 4 years, you actually have time. I want you to—" He stopped. "Take it. Please. Take the time." They talked for another 20 minutes about small things, his classes, the Lisbon weather, the apartment, a bookshop near his street that he'd become devoted to. She memorized details. She always memorized details about him, had been doing it since he was small, the way you memorized things you were afraid of losing. When they hung up, she sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Then she went downstairs. Alessandro was in the kitchen with his back to her, doing something at the counter that turned out to be making coffee, and she stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment. He moved efficiently in kitchen spaces, which suggested he used them, which suggested he was more domestically capable than his position implied. He turned when he heard her and read her face with that complete attention. "All right?" he asked. "Yes." She sat at the table. "Better than I've been in 8 months." He set a cup in front of her and sat across from her with his own. The rain was easing. Outside, the sea was beginning to clarify from hammered grey toward something more silver. "He sounds well," she said. "He's learning Portuguese." She paused. "He's enrolled in a class. He's making a life there." "Good." His voice was simple, genuine. "You made that possible." "You made it possible," he said. "Years before I was involved, I maintained a situation you had built." She looked at him across the table. "Why does it matter to you that I understand the distinction?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I want you to understand what's yours," he said. "What you did, what you earned." His voice was careful. "I've spent a great deal of my life in arrangements where the contribution of other people, especially women in this family's world, gets absorbed into the operation and stops being legible as theirs." He paused. "I find I'm interested in preventing that, with you specifically." She heard the last 2 words. She sat with them. "That's an unusual position for a man in your position," she said. "I'm aware." The corner of his mouth. "Carmine finds it baffling." "What does Carmine find baffling specifically?" "That I spent 6 months reviewing your case and came away with the conclusion that you were the more competent half of any potential partnership." His voice was even, informative, with a thread of something underneath it that she was starting to identify as the way he expressed things he found difficult to say directly. Wrapped in fact, delivered sideways, arriving regardless. And that this seemed to me not a problem to be managed, but an asset to be acknowledged. She drank her coffee. "Tell me something about the business," she said. "Not operational detail, something that matters to you." He looked at her for a moment, seeming to decide. "There's a school in Secondigliano," he said. "I've been funding it for 8 years, anonymously. The foundation that funds it is 3 removes from anything with my name on it." He paused. "It has a music program. My mother used to teach piano. She couldn't continue after my father's position became what it became. She was afraid for us." He paused again. "I fund the program because she should have been able to continue, and she couldn't. And I can't fix that. But I can." He stopped. "You can do something," she finished. "Yes." She looked at him, the man who studied the endings of empires, who had a room full of history books he'd never shown anyone, who funded a music school in Secondigliano in anonymous tribute to his mother's foregone vocation, who had kept her brother safe, without telling her, without conditions, without expecting credit. She was in very serious trouble. She recognized it with the same cold clarity with which she recognized most dangerous things, fully, precisely, and too late to do anything except manage the exposure. "I want to see the room," she said. He blinked. The first genuine, unguarded surprise she'd seen on his face. "The room of history books," she clarified. "When we're back in Naples, I want to see it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, and something in the word was different from his other yeses, quieter and more careful and more real. They returned to Naples on a Friday. The apartment on the Posillipo hillside received them, if apartments could be said to receive people, with the particular atmosphere of spaces that have been carefully designed and lived in alone for a long time. A settled quality, things precisely where they were placed, no comfortable disorder, no evidence of another person's habits layered over. Julia had brought 3 boxes of books and her grandmother's blanket. She placed the books on the shelves in the room she claimed as her own, a corner room with 2 windows, one facing the bay and one facing the city, which she had chosen on the first tour because the sightlines were excellent and also because the double aspect of it appealed to her, the wide sea on one side, the dense city on the other, and draped the blanket over the chair and sat in the chair and looked at both windows for a while and felt something settle that she hadn't expected to settle. She was, she realized with some surprise, not unhappy. This seemed worth examining. Alessandro's study was on the 2nd floor, access through a door that was always closed. He showed it to her the second evening back, with a quietness that she understood was not reluctance so much as exposure, the particular self-consciousness of someone accustomed to privacy opening a private thing. The room was exactly as she'd imagined from his description, and nothing like what she'd imagined from his exterior. Books floor to ceiling, yes, she'd expected that, but not the organisation, which was geographic temporal, empires arranged by their span and their geography, with handwritten index cards on the shelves noting key texts and their arguments, and not the maps on the far wall, 6 of them, historical maps of the Mediterranean basin at different periods, with small pencil annotations in a script so fine she had to step close to read them. And not the photograph on the desk, small, framed, clearly old, of a woman at a piano. "Your mother," she said. "Yes, 1987. He was standing behind her, to the side, watching her move through the room with the careful attention of someone who had never had to watch anything in this space before and wasn't sure how it felt. She was 30 then. She was teaching at the Conservatorio. Before. Yes. She looked at the maps. She looked at the books. She reached out and touched the spine of one. Gibbon's Decline and Fall, a modern edition, heavily annotated in the margins, which she could see from the pages bristling with sticky notes. "You write in your books," she said. "I have a terrible habit of it." He sounded for a moment genuinely rueful. "The annotations make them worthless to dealers." "To dealers," she agreed, "not to readers." She turned to look at him. "May I borrow this?" He looked at her with the expression she was becoming fluent in, the one that was surprise without surprise, recognition without quite being what he expected. "Yes," he said. She took the Gibbon and held it against her chest and looked around the room. "You were right," she said. "It looks obsessive." "Yes." "I mean that as a compliment." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know." The first official function they attended back in Naples was a dinner at the Posillipo Yacht Club, where several of the city's most established families gathered monthly to perform the rituals of their class with the slightly self-conscious devotion of people who understood the performance was partly ironic and did it anyway. Julia wore dark green. She had bought it herself from a small atelier in Pozzuoli, run by a woman her age who had been making clothes since she was 15, and who had looked at Julia's proportions and chosen the fabric before Julia had said a word. She was aware, as they entered the room, of what she was. No longer Giulia Esposito, the competent, quietly struggling last of an old family. She was Giulia Vitelli, which was an entirely different gravitational field. She could feel the room's attention reorganize. She also felt Alessandro's hand come to the small of her back as they entered, not possessive, not performative, simply present, the way he was present in everything, with a complete, steady attention. And she didn't step away from it. The dinner was navigated, the social circuitry was performed. She was excellent at this now. 4 years of managing the Esposito interests had made her fluent in the grammar of rooms like this. Midway through the evening, a woman named Elena Greco, old money, gallery owner, approximately 50, with the kind of beauty that improved with age and the kind of social cruelty that pretended to be wit, positioned herself near Giulia and said, with the pleasantness of a knife wrapped in silk, "How are you finding the adjustment?" "It must be quite a change." "From?" Giulia asked pleasantly. "Well, the Esposito situation was," a carefully constructed pause, "difficult in recent years. This must be a considerable relief." Giulia looked at her with the same pleasantness. "Every change is an adjustment," she said. "I find I adapt well." She paused. "The Esposito name has been in Naples for 140 years. Adjustments don't trouble old names." Elena blinked. "Excuse me," Giulia said, and moved away. From across the room, she felt Alessandro's eyes find her. She didn't look at him. She accepted a glass from a passing tray and took a sip and kept moving. And she heard, or perhaps imagined, the quality of his attention shift, the way you heard the note change when a string was drawn tighter. Later, in the car on the way home, he said, "Elena Greco." "Yes." "How was that?" "Manageable." She looked out the window at Naples passing. She was testing whether the Esposito name was something I'd let her take from me. And? And it isn't. She paused. She knows that now. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good." One word. The satisfaction in it was not triumph, not possessiveness, something more specific than both. The satisfaction of a man watching someone he respects hold their own ground. She looked at him in the back seats dark. "You were watching," she said. "I was watching," he confirmed, without apology. "Were you going to?" "No." "Certain, immediate. You had it." "You knew I had it." "Yes." She turned back to the window. The city lights were doing their thing, the layered, anarchic brightness of Naples at night, every era of the city's history lit simultaneously, the ancient and the modern, without hierarchy. "I want to go to Secondigliano on Saturday," she said, "to the school." A pause. "Why?" "Because I want to see it." She turned to look at him. "Is that all right?" Something moved in his face, something he didn't immediately manage. "Yes," he said. "We don't have to announce ourselves. Just go." She paused. "I want to hear the music." He looked at her for a long moment. "Saturday," he said. The school was called the Fondazione Melodia, which Giulia thought was either the most beautiful or the most Naples possible name for a school in Secondigliano. They arrived on a Saturday morning in Alessandro's car, not the formal one, but the unremarked black sedan that he drove himself, which he had learned was how he moved through the city when he didn't want to announce himself, which was more often than his position required. He wore jeans. She noted this. She had not previously seen him in jeans. He was, she found herself thinking, entirely too attractive in jeans, which was an absurd and inconvenient observation that she filed and refused to examine. The school occupied a converted warehouse on a street that the city had been promised would be renovated for 15 years. The buildings around it were in various states of weather. The school itself was cared for. Clean windows, repaired facade, a small garden along the front wall with actual plants in it, tended. The contrast to its surroundings was deliberate and specific, the way an argument is deliberate. They walked in with the social invisibility of two people who look like they belong somewhere and move with certainty, which, in Julia's experience, was the most effective disguise available. The music reached her first. A classroom on the second floor, she could hear it from the stairwell. A violin, careful and earnest, with the particular concentration of a child finding the music inside the instrument. Then, around the corner, a piano in a room with its door open, a teacher's voice calling the tempo softly, and a group of children in small chairs making their way through something in C major with the determined imprecision of beginners. She stopped in the doorway. Alessandro stopped beside her. The teacher was young, mid-20s, patient, entirely absorbed in her students. The children were concentrated with the specific intensity of children who have decided they want to do a thing and are doing it, and know that failing is part of the process and are fine with that. One boy in the back row was counting under his breath, his lips moving silently, his small hands positioned with enormous care. She felt Alessandro go very still beside her. She didn't look at him. She watched the children. After a moment, the teacher looked up and saw them in the doorway and smiled the professional smile of someone used to observers. "Come in if you like," she said. They didn't. But they stayed in the doorway for several more minutes listening, and then they moved on down the hall to the next room, where an older group was working on something more complex. She recognized it, eventually, as a simplified Vivaldi, and they stood and listened to that, too. On the walk back to the car, they were quiet. She didn't reach for his hand. But when they reached the car and he opened the door for her, and their hands brushed in the exchange of keys or balance or simply the proximity of the moment, she held the contact a beat longer than was necessary, and he did too. And they were both aware of it, and neither of them made it into a thing. And she got in the car, and he got in beside her, and they drove back into Naples with the radio low and the city doing its morning business around them. "The boy in the back row," she said finally, as they were coming up through Fuori Grotta, counting under his breath. "Yes." His voice was quiet. "That was me at that age," she said, "learning to read sheet music. I always had to count out loud, and my teacher used to tell me to stop." She paused. "I was never very good." "Did you continue?" "No. The lessons stopped when my mother died. I was 14. She looked out the window. "I always meant to go back to it." A pause. "You should," he said. "I wouldn't know where to start after 15 years. "The same place you started the first time," he said. "C major." She laughed. It was small and genuine, and it surprised her, and she felt him register it beside her. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with something careful and pleased that he kept quiet and didn't announce, and she thought, this is what he's like. This is what he's actually like underneath everything he's built around himself. And she found that she wanted to know more of it. This was, she understood, the most dangerous thing yet. The threat, when it arrived in the form of a man named Grimaldi. Not the Grimaldi family, a man named Grimaldi who worked for a consortium of interests based partly in Palermo and partly in Amsterdam, which was the kind of international arrangement that had become more common as global financial systems had become more convenient for moving certain kinds of money. He was not the principal. He was, Alessandro's people determined within 24 hours of his appearing on the radar, a messenger with teeth. Giulia learned about this not from Alessandro, as per their agreement, but from Carmine, who arrived at the apartment on a Wednesday morning with the expression of a man who had been told to relay information and found the telling uncomfortable. "What is it?" she said. Carmine was approximately 50, broad, with a face that had been shaped by decades of professional worry into permanent, careful neutrality. He had been, she gathered, deeply sceptical of her when the arrangement was first proposed. He had, she further gathered, revised this position sometime in the past month, for reasons he hadn't articulated and she hadn't asked about. "There's been an approach," he said, "from a party called Grimaldi. They have intelligence suggesting the Esposito family maintained documentation of regional operations. They are interested in acquiring or suppressing this documentation." She was quiet for a moment. "How did they learn about the documentation?" she asked. "Same accountant as previously. He sold to multiple parties before we relocated him." She processed this. "Alessandro knows?" "He asked me to brief you directly, per your arrangement." Carmine's voice was neutral, but she heard something in it. An appraisal, she thought. He was watching how she handled this. "What's Grimaldi proposing?" she said. "Contact. A meeting. They've suggested a private setting you're choosing." "And Alessandro's assessment of their intentions?" "Hostile, potentially. Not immediately violent. They're too careful for that, and they're operating in unfamiliar territory. But ultimately hostile, yes." She nodded. "Tell me what my options are, from an operational standpoint, not Alessandro's options, mine specifically, with the documentation in my possession." Carmine looked at her for a long moment. "The documentation," he said carefully, "would be of significant interest to several parties. As leverage, properly deployed, I know what it is," she said. "I've known since I was 22. Tell me what Grimaldi's exposure is, specifically." He told her. She listened. She asked 3 questions, all precise, all targeting the gaps in what he'd said. She watched him revise his expression accordingly, the careful neutrality shifting towards something that might, in better lighting, have been respect. When Alessandra returned that evening, she was in the study with the Grimaldi information laid out on the desk. Carmine had been thorough, and the documentation from the family box open beside it for the first time in 2 years. He came to the doorway and looked at what she had on the desk. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "The Grimaldi approach is about the documentation," she said. "I'm going to handle it. Not through your channels, through mine. The documentation is Esposito property, and this is an Esposito problem, and I want it to be resolved by Esposito methods." He was very still. She could see him processing it, the instinct clearly present to manage the situation himself, and the restraint over the instinct also clearly present, deliberate and controlled. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Two things. A meeting room, somewhere I can receive Grimaldi on my terms, and a guarantee that your people won't be in the room or visible on the perimeter." "That's a security risk." "Yes." She met his eyes. "Your people can be available, not visible. I need Grimaldi to believe he's meeting with the Esposito heir, not with Vitelli backup." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he asked. "Because the documentation's value comes from the Esposito name," she said, "from the fact that it's been maintained by one family over 40 years with perfect discretion. If Grimaldi believes the Vitellis now control it, its character changes, its utility changes." She paused. "I'm not just settling a threat. I'm communicating what the documentation is and who owns it and what happens to people who misunderstand those facts." Alessandro was quiet for approximately 10 seconds, which in his economy of expression was a very long time. "Yes," he said, "I'll arrange it. The perimeter will not be visible," he said, "but I will be in the building." She looked at him. "Alessandro." "In the building," he said again, and his voice was very quiet and very final. "I will be in the building. That's the condition I am not negotiating." She understood, in the quality of the sentence, that there was no version of this in which he was not in the building, and that arguing it would cost her goodwill she might need for something important, and that also, she was honest with herself, she didn't entirely want to argue it. "In the building," she agreed. Something in him released slightly, just slightly. "Tell me what else you need," he said. The meeting room was on the third floor of a building on the Via Toledo that belonged, through several intermediaries, to a law firm that had been doing quiet business for decades with both the Esposito and Vitelli families. Neutral ground, sort of. The Naples version of neutral ground, which was to say neutral only if all parties agreed to the fiction of it and were invested enough in the fiction's maintenance to behave accordingly. Grimaldi arrived 15 minutes early, which told her he was nervous. She arrived exactly on time, alone, visibly, with the documentation box under her arm, and sat across from him at the conference table, with the composure she had been building for 4 years, and the last 4 weeks, of learning to be in rooms with Alessandro Vitelli. Grimaldi was 50. Swiss-Italian, with the smooth mannerisms of an international operator and the eyes of someone who had calculated the angles before entering the room. He had brought one other person, a woman, quiet, who positioned herself along the wall and didn't speak. "Signora Vitelli," he said. "Esposito Vitelli," she said pleasantly. "I prefer the full name for business conversations. It helps establish continuity." His eyes moved to the box. "The documentation," she said, "has been in the Esposito family's keeping since 1981. It's been maintained with absolute discretion. No copies, no digital records, no distributed storage." She set the box on the table between them, not opening it. "The people whose activities it documents have been living with that fact for decades. Some of them have been remarkably grateful for the discretion. Others have tried at various points to alter the arrangement." "And," Grimaldi said. "The documentation is still here," she said. "They are not." A pause. "My clients," he said carefully, "are interested in a business arrangement. The documentation represents a significant liability for several of their operations. They would like to—" negotiate its status. I know what they want, she said. What they want is for it to disappear. What I want them to understand is why that's not possible, and why attempting to make it possible would be their single worst decision. She kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her voice entirely pleasant. She was thinking in the back of her mind that Alessandro was in the building, somewhere below, with the stillness of a man exercising the most substantial restraint he'd ever exercised, and that this was, in its strange way, steadying. The documentation, she said, is real. It is specific, and it is arranged, not stored with me, not accessible through my death or disappearance or any other disruption you might be contemplating, in a way that its release is automatic under certain conditions. She paused. This is not a threat. It's a structural fact. The system was designed this way. My grandfather was a careful man. Grimaldi was very still. What your clients need to understand, she continued, is that the documentation functions as insurance for everyone it covers, including them. She paused. The Esposito family has never used it offensively in 40 years. We have no interest in doing so now. What we do have interest in is being left entirely alone, to live our lives without interference. She looked at him steadily. Deliver that message, she said, accurately. The alternative is not something I'll be specific about, because I think your clients are intelligent enough to fill in the details. Grimaldi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The Vitelli connection changes the calculation for my clients. The Vitelli connection, she said, is irrelevant to the documentation. The documentation belongs to the Esposito family. It was built by the Esposito family. It remains in Esposito custody. She paused. What the Vitelli connection means for your clients is that if they make a poor decision, they'll be dealing with a problem that has a great deal more resources behind it than it did 6 months ago. This seems to me like a reason to make good decisions rather than poor ones. She stood up. Thank you for coming, she said, with the pleasantness she had borrowed and learned and made her own. I hope we don't need to do this again. She picked up the box and walked out of the room. In the car downstairs, not visible from the meeting room, not close enough to constitute the presence she'd asked him not to maintain, Alessandro was sitting in the back seat when she came out. She got in beside him. He looked at her. She looked at him. Done, she said. He let out a breath. It was small and controlled, but she heard it. How did it go? He asked. Grimaldi will report accurately, she said. His clients will recalculate. They're not irrational. They're just accustomed to problems being solvable by direct action. I needed to make clear that this one isn't. She paused. I think I did. Yes, he said. She looked at him. You were listening. He didn't deny it. Not the room, he said, but the building has... I apologize. She looked at him for a moment. Did you trust that I could handle it? She asked. Yes, his voice was immediate. I was not trusting. I was... He stopped. Incapable of not being there, she said. A pause. Yes. She leaned her head back against the seat. She was tired. The specific exhaustion of high performance, the adrenaline metabolizing into fatigue. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. I'm not angry. She looked at the ceiling of the car. You were in the building. You didn't come in. That's—" She paused. "That's you trying, and it counts." She heard him shift beside her. She didn't look. "Julia," he said, and the way he said her name was different from every time he'd said it before, stripped of its usual evenness, not controlled, not careful, raw in the way of something that had been careful for too long. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that still, depthless gaze, and the carefulness was there, but something else was there too, something that had been growing since the terrace in Amalfi, and the rain in the study, and Secondigliano, and the boy counting under his breath, something she'd been watching accumulate without naming it, and she named it now. "I know," she said softly. His hand moved. He put it over hers on the seat between them, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't pull away. It was not a sudden thing. She wanted to be clear about this, to herself, in the accounting she did in the corner room with the double aspect, city on one side, sea on the other, at night when the apartment was quiet. It was not a sudden thing, not a single moment that turned the dial, not the dramatic capitulation that she had always mistrusted in novels and films. It was, instead, an accumulation. The way he made coffee without being asked when she was working late. The way he redistributed space in the apartment when he noticed she always chose the chair with the better sightline to the door. He rearranged the sitting room on a Tuesday while she was at a meeting, and said nothing about it when she came home, just waited for her to notice and choose the better chair and settle into it before he returned to whatever he'd been reading. The way he remembered things she mentioned once, that the coffee from the place on the Viale was too bitter, that she preferred the baker 2 streets over, that she hated the specific kind of social event where everyone already knew the point of the gathering, but was required to pretend they didn't. He arrived at her room one evening with a book under his arm and knocked, which he always did. She told him to come in. He sat in the second chair, the one that had been placed there at some point in the past 2 weeks, she wasn't sure exactly when, and opened the book and read. And she read, and they occupied the room together for 3 hours without speaking, and she fell asleep in the chair and woke to find that someone had placed a blanket over her, and the lamp had been adjusted so the light fell away from her face. She lay still for a moment, under the blanket, listening to the city outside and the apartment quiet around her. Then she picked up the book she'd been reading and went to find him. He was in the kitchen at 11:30 at night, which surprised her. He was at the counter reading something on his phone with a glass of water beside him, and he looked up when she came in with the kind of attention that she'd stopped trying to find the right word for. It wasn't vigilance, it wasn't calculation, it was just her, just the fact of her, entering the room and mattering. "Thank you for the blanket," she said. "You were cold," he said. She stood in the kitchen doorway holding her book against her chest. "Alessandro." "Yes?" "I want to say something." He put the phone down and turned to face her fully. He didn't come toward her. He gave her the space of the kitchen, which was exactly the right thing to do. "I've been managing things alone for a long time," she said. "Not just the business. I mean, the way I exist in the world. I've been entirely self-contained, out of necessity." She paused. "It's become a habit." He was quiet. "I'm working on the habit," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his glass of water and held it and said, Very quietly, I've been alone in a room with the door open for 15 years and told myself it was a choice. She heard it. Was it? She asked. Partly, he said, and partly I hadn't found a reason to close the gap. He paused, between the room and everyone else. She crossed the kitchen. She had not exactly decided to. She had decided not to not, which was slightly different. She came to stand directly in front of him, and she looked up at him. He was taller than she'd processed, close like this, or the proximity made it different. And she said, "Tell me what you want." His eyes were very still. "You," he said, entirely simple, entirely certain, in every available sense. "That's a significant statement," she said. "Yes." No qualification, no softening, just yes. She put her hand on his chest. She felt him go absolutely still under her palm, the way things go still that are containing something large. "I'm not ready to trust this completely," she said honestly. "I'm not there yet." "I know." "I need you to know that I know what I'm doing," she said, "that this isn't, that I'm not Julia." His voice was the quietest she'd heard it. "I've been watching you make decisions for 6 months. I am not concerned that you don't know what you're doing." She looked at him for a long moment, then she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was careful at first, both of them careful. She felt it in him, the same quality she applied to most things, the precision of a man who understood the weight of what he was doing and chose it deliberately rather than reaching for it blindly. His hands came to her face, not pulling her in, just holding, the way you held something you didn't want to break. She felt the carefulness give way slowly to something that had been contained a very long time. And she let it, and her hands moved to his shoulders, and she felt the solid reality of him and thought, This is the dangerous part, not the power or the name or the complexity. This. He pulled back after a moment, not far, just enough to look at her. His hands were still on her face. "You're going to complicate my life enormously," he said. "I thought I already had," she said. "More." His thumb moved, the smallest possible movement across her cheekbone. "You're going to complicate it more." "Good," she said, and she meant it. He looked at her with his whole face open in a way she hadn't seen before. The careful man behind the careful architecture, visible, present. Then he kissed her again, and this time neither of them was careful at all. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, 3 weeks later. Julia was awake. She was always awake by 6, had been since she was 24, when the transition from student to operator had reset her circadian rhythms permanently. She was in the corner room reading when her phone lit up with a number she recognized, her contact at the notary's office in Lisbon. She answered immediately. "There's been a development," the contact said, "with the younger Esposito." She went still. "Tell me." "He's fine," the contact said quickly. "He's safe, but he's been approached by someone asking about the Esposito family situation, someone who knows who he is." She closed the book in her lap. "When?" "Yesterday evening. He called me this morning." "Who was doing the approach?" "He didn't get a name. A man, Italian, mid-40s. He said he was representing people with interests in Naples. He knew Luca's real name." She put the book down and stood up and crossed to the window. Naples was doing its early morning thing below, the light flat and promising, the city sounds layered and familiar. "Tell him not to leave his apartment until he hears from me," she said. "Today, within the hour." She hung up and stood at the window. Then she went to find Alessandro. He was already awake, dressed, coffee made. He did these things in the morning with the efficiency of someone who had been managing an operation for 15 years. She came into the kitchen, and he took one look at her face and set the cup down. She told him. He listened without interrupting. He had the ability, she had learned, to be entirely still and entirely present simultaneously, when the situation required it, which was a significant skill and not a common one. When she finished, he said, "Grimaldi." "That's my assessment too." "They didn't take the meeting seriously enough," he said. "Not angry, assessing. Cold, in the way that was the most effective possible temperature for this kind of problem. Or they took it seriously, and this is their counter," she said. He picked up his phone. "I'll have the Lisbon situation reinforced within 2 hours. He looked at her. "My people or yours?" She considered this. "Yours," she said. "Faster deployment." He nodded and stepped into the hallway to make the calls. She stood in the kitchen and drank the coffee he'd made and thought about Luca in a Lisbon apartment, being approached by a stranger who knew his name, and she let herself feel the fear. She had learned in the past years that letting it happen briefly was more efficient than suppressing it. Suppression took energy. Brief acknowledgement and release did not. And then she put it down and started thinking about what she needed to do. Alessandro came back in 20 minutes. "The Lisbon situation is handled," he said. "4 of my people are deployed. 1 is stationed at his building from tonight, and I've had his contact information changed." He paused. "Luca doesn't know the people are there. I can tell him or not, as you prefer." "Tell him," she said. "He needs to know what's happening. He's not a child to be managed." "No," he agreed. She looked at Alessandro. "And Grimaldi?" "Grimaldi is going to have a very bad several days," he said, in the same even voice. There was something underneath it. Controlled fury was the most accurate name for it, the kind of cold, precise rage that was more frightening than heat because it produced results. "I want to be involved in the response," she said. "Yes." No hesitation. "Not peripherally. Julia," he looked at her, "you're not peripheral to anything we do." He said it simply, as a statement of fact rather than reassurance, and she felt it land differently for that. She nodded. "Then let's start." The response to Grimaldi took 11 days. Julia was involved in every strategic decision and none of the operational details, a distinction Alessandro maintained not out of protectiveness, she understood, but out of the clear-eyed division between what she needed to know and what she was better without, which was a distinction she appreciated and replicated in her own decision-making. On the 8th day, Grimaldi's consortium released a formal withdrawal from the Naples situation. Alessandro had never told her exactly what he'd done, and she had not asked, because they had agreed on the scope of her involvement, and this fell outside it, and because she trusted, she realized, using that word, that the withdrawal was real. Luca called her from Lisbon on the 10th day. "It's calmer here," he said. The people, your husband's people, I know. One of them taught me a card game yesterday." She laughed. "Of course he did. He's called Eduardo. He's from Catania. He has a daughter my age. Luca, I'm just telling you." His voice went soft. "He's keeping me company. That's all." She sat with the warmth of this. Her brother, alone in a Lisbon apartment for 8 months, being taught card games by a man from Catania who had a daughter his age and who was there because Alessandro had put him there. "Come home," she said, "when it's safe. Come home." "I will," he said. "I will. I promise." January in Naples was cold in the way that only Mediterranean cities knew how to be cold. Not brutally, not with the self-righteous seriousness of northern winters, but with a damp intimacy that got inside things, inside stone walls and old bones and carefully maintained exteriors, and reminded you that the warmth was seasonal and the city's actual nature was older and harder than the summer light suggested. Julia spent an increasing amount of January in the history room. This had become a habit she hadn't quite decided on. She found herself there in the evenings, after dinner, pulled by the specific combination of the maps on the wall and the cold light from the window and the books with their marginalia. Alessandro's handwriting in the margins of Gibbon and Toynbee and Brodel, small and precise and frequently argumentative, the annotations of a man in genuine dialogue with the text. She started writing her own notes in the books she borrowed and leaving them there. He never commented on this directly, but he started leaving books on the small table by the second chair, the chair that had appeared and become hers, with pages marked and occasionally his own thoughts already there at the passage, anticipating what he thought she'd think, which was accurate enough times to be unsettling. "You're doing this deliberately," she said one evening, turning the open book toward him. He looked at the passage, at his margin note, at her margin note in response. His mouth moved toward the smile she'd become fluent in. "Yes." "It's quite annoying," she said. "Is it? You're arguing with me via historical text in a book written 300 years ago." It seemed an efficient format, he said. "You're enjoying yourself." "Enormously." She looked at him across the history room, with the maps on the wall and the cold window light and Naples pressing close on all sides, and she thought about the accounting she'd been doing since October, what she'd known about him at the first dinner, what she knew now. The distance between those 2 points, measured in conversations and silences, and one documented mercy she hadn't asked for, and everything that had followed from it. "Tell me something I don't know," she said. He looked at the window for a moment. "I was afraid of my father until I was 26 years old," he said. "Not physically afraid, the other kind. The kind where the person's opinion of you is the architecture you build your sense of self inside, and you don't realize it's not load-bearing until something happens that tests it." He paused. "What happened was the Reggio incident." She was very still. "Afterwards," he said, "I spent 2 years—" He stopped. "Renegotiating my own internal structure, I suppose. Understanding who I was when the architecture fell." He paused. What was left? "What was left?" she asked. He looked at her. "This," he said, "what you've been dealing with since October. This is what was left." She put the book down. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the window seat, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she leaned her head against him and felt him go still with that containing quality. And then she felt his arm come around her shoulders, careful and complete. The Reggio incident, she said. What do you need me to know about it? That I've asked myself every year since, whether what I did was the only option, he said, and every year the answer is— He paused. Not certain. That's honest, she said. Yes. His arm tightened slightly. I wanted you to have the honest version. Not the version where you're certain it was necessary. Not that version, no. A pause. I've never found the certainty satisfying. Men in this life learn to find it satisfying, the certainty. I never quite managed it. She tilted her head to look up at him. Is that a problem? Philosophically, he said, I think it's not. A pause. Practically, it complicates certain decisions. Good, she said. He looked down at her. Good? If you were certain, she said, I'd trust you less. The uncertainty is— it's evidence of something. Something that makes you safer to trust. He was quiet for a long moment. Then his hand moved in her hair, a gesture so careful it was almost not a gesture. And he said, very quietly, Julia. I know, she said. I know. She closed her eyes and listened to Naples outside, and to the sound of his breathing and the faint traffic from the hill below. And she thought about what the next chapters of the accounting would look like, and decided that she could wait for them. She was learning to wait. She was learning that waiting was not the same as losing ground. I want Luca to come home, she said. He will. I want him to come to dinner when he does. Here. Alessandra was quiet for a moment, and she felt the significance of what she was saying move through him, the invitation implicit in it, the expansion of the circle of here, the private claim of here being theirs rather than his. Yes, he said, I want to meet him. He'll ask you inappropriate questions, she said. Good. His voice was warm in a way she was still sometimes surprised by. I have some answers prepared. You've been thinking about this? For some time, he said honestly. She smiled against his shoulder. Alessandro, she said. Yes. Stop being so you for 5 minutes. The smallest pause. I'm not sure I know how. No, she agreed. I don't suppose you do. March came, and the city opened like a hand. This was the thing about Naples that never stopped being true, no matter how many times you witnessed it. The way the spring arrived not gradually, but decisively. A morning you woke, and the quality of the light was different, and everything was different, and the city that had been clenched against the winter was suddenly entirely itself again, laundry in the streets, and scooters and children, and the smell of the sea coming warm and actual from the direction of the bay. Luca arrived on a Thursday in the second week of March. He came through the official channels that had been arranged, documents regularized, the situation with the Ferraro people resolved through a combination of Alessandro's leverage and, quietly, the Esposito documentation making a single, surgical, targeted appearance in a conversation with a Ferraro intermediary. Not a weapon. Insurance, deployed with precision, the way her grandfather had always intended. He came off the flight from Lisbon with a backpack and a new jacket and hair that was longer than she remembered and a face that had grown into itself in the year and a half he'd been away, and he saw her in the arrivals hall and stopped walking. She crossed to him. He was taller than she remembered. He had her mother's eyes, which she had forgotten. She put her hands on his face and looked at him for a moment, and then she pulled him into a hug that was fierce and complete, and that she held longer than was rational, and she felt him hold her back just as hard, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You got married," he said into her shoulder. "I did. Without me. You were unavailable." He pulled back and looked at her, and she saw in his face everything that had passed between them in the 18 months of coded messages and intermediary calls and card games with Eduardo from Catania. "I'm sorry," he said. "Stop," she said. "You're here now." The dinner was at the Posillipo apartment, just the three of them. Alessandro had suggested this when she'd mentioned that a large gathering might overwhelm a return, which was exactly the right suggestion. And she had thought again about how he understood things without being told them. Luca arrived with wine, which was a Luca thing to do. He always brought something, had since he was 15, the habit of showing up to someone's house bearing gifts in the Italian tradition that their grandmother had instilled and which had survived emigration and fugitivity, apparently intact. He shook Alessandro's hand in the hallway, and Giulia watched them take each other's measure, both of them doing it with the directness of people who had already decided to be honest. "You look like trouble," Luca said. Alessandro looked at him. "Your sister said you'd say that." Luca glanced at Giulia. "She told you?" "She warned me." A pause. "She said you had your father's facility for languages and your mother's survival instinct." Luca was quiet for a moment, and Giulia saw something move in his face, the specific grief of a person hearing their parents described by someone who never met them, and the specific warmth of hearing them described accurately. "She talks about them," Luca said. "She does." Alessandro stepped back to let him in. "Come in." They ate on the terrace because the March evening was mild enough and the bay was extraordinary in the spring dark, and Giulia watched her husband and her brother across the table in the candlelight and felt the accounting shift in a way she hadn't anticipated. They argued about music after the first course, genuinely argued. Luca had enthusiasms and Alessandro had opinions, and they were apparently not identical, and the argument was quick and specific and never unkind, and Giulia ate bread and watched them and felt something she recognized, eventually, as happiness, a small happiness, provisional and careful, but real. After dinner, when Luca had gone to the bathroom and Alessandro was refilling glasses, she said quietly, "Eduardo." He looked at her. "He taught Luca cards," she said. "All winter." "Eduardo is excellent at cards," Alessandro said neutrally. "He was keeping him company." "Eduardo has a daughter Luca's age. He understood what the boy needed." "You told him to." A pause. "I told him to make sure Luca was safe. I didn't specify method." He paused. "Eduardo is creative." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "Not for Grimaldi or the documentation or the logistics. For Eduardo from Catania, playing cards all winter with a lonely 23-year-old who was learning Portuguese." He looked at her across the candles. "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't thank me. He's your brother." A pause, and something in his voice was very quiet and very direct. "He's your family. There's nothing to thank me for." She heard, in the architecture of that sentence, something large. The understanding of what family was, the people you protected without accounting, without conditions, without the ledger of obligation. Something he had been given by birth into a family that weaponized it and had spent adulthood reconstructing into something it should have been. Luca came back to the terrace, and they stayed late, talking about Lisbon and Portuguese and a bookshop near his street, and what he intended to do now that he was home. And the city was warm around them, and the bay was dark and generous, and the candles burned low, and nobody moved to end the evening until well past midnight. Spring deepened. Naples did what Naples did when the season cooperated, which was to become so beautiful that you could almost forget its nature. The layers of history and violence and survival and transcendence, all glazed over by the light coming off the bay. The yellow buildings, the bougainvillea on the old walls, the particular buoyancy of a Mediterranean city in April that made everything look like something you'd remember forever. Julia had been making adjustments, not wholesale transformations. She had not stopped being the woman she'd been, had not softened into something unrecognizable, had not surrendered the armor she'd built because she now had reason to take it off sometimes. She had, instead, made the specific adjustments of someone who had admitted that the life they were living was worth inhabiting with more than functional attention. She had, in small ways, begun to allow herself things. She began piano lessons with a teacher from the Conservatorio, a woman of 60 who had no interest in sentiment and complete interest in technique, which was exactly right. She practiced in the mornings in the room off the library that had a small upright piano Alessandro had arranged to appear one day with the same wordless efficiency with which he arranged most things. She was terrible. She would probably be terrible for months. She found she didn't mind. She had dinner regularly with her uncle Enzo, who was declining slowly, and who was grateful in his quiet way for the consistency. She brought him books and sat with him, and they talked about the family and about Naples, and sometimes about her father, which was the most honest they'd been with each other in years. She had begun, very slowly, to tell Luca things she hadn't told him before. The full shape of the 4 years after their father died, the decisions she'd made, the fear she'd managed alone. He listened and was quiet, and occasionally said, "I'm sorry you did that alone." She said, "You were 20. I didn't want you to carry it." He said, "You're still doing that." She said, "I know. I'm working on it." She had, most significantly, begun to let Alessandro in. Not in the dramatic sense. She had never been built for drama, and he understood this, operated around her actual nature rather than a projected ideal of her. But in the ways that mattered. She told him when she was afraid, instead of managing it privately. She asked his opinion on decisions she could have made alone. She shared the room of herself that she had been maintaining in solitude for years, and found that it was larger for having 2 people in it. He, in turn, had been making his own adjustments. He had started with evident effort, telling her things before situations resolved rather than after. He had told her about the Grimaldi response in real time, which she understood had cost him something against his instincts. He had told her, on a Tuesday evening while she was doing something unremarkable at the kitchen table, that he had loved 3 things in his life: history, the city, and now her, in that order, and that the order was not a ranking. She had looked up from what she was doing. "That's not a comfortable thing to say," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I preferred the discomfort to the alternative." She had thought about it for a while, the way she thought about important things, turning it in her mind, examining the facets, looking for what was true and what was performance. She found nothing but truth. "I'm getting there," she said. "Give me time." "I have nothing but time," he said. They had a fight in April. A real one, not cold, not controlled, not the kind of carefully modulated disagreement that two disciplined people managed when they were both trying to be reasonable. A real fight, with raised voices, and Julia saying things she'd been carrying for months about the weight of his protectiveness, about the difference between being kept safe and being managed, about the fact that she needed room to fail at things sometimes without having the failure intercepted before it happened. He said things too, about the difficulty of watching someone he cared about in danger without intervening, about the architecture of fear that had been his operating system since he was 9 years old, about the gap between what he knew was right and what every instinct in him demanded. It was ugly for about 20 minutes. Then she stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at him, both of them standing in the hallway, her coat half on because she'd been leaving and turned back to finish the argument, and said, "We're doing this wrong." He stopped too. "Tell me what right looks like," he said. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know it's not this." She took her coat off. He put his hand on the wall and leaned against it and let out a breath. They went and sat in the history room, and they talked for 3 hours, and it was harder than the fight had been, but at the end of it something had been cleared that had been accumulating since October. The residue of two very private people attempting proximity. And she felt cleaner for it, and she thought he did too, though she didn't ask. "We should do that again sometime," she said finally. He looked at her. "Fight? Talk like that," she paused, "without the fight first, ideally." The corner of his mouth. The real version now, the one she'd learned to read. "I'll work on the sequencing." "I appreciate that." He reached across the space between them, not taking her hand, just resting his palm open on the table between them. An offer, not a claim. She put her hand in his. Summer arrived the way Naples summers always arrived, without apology and completely. The bay was blindingly blue from every elevation, the piazzas filled with the particular chaos of a city that understood heat as permission, and the ancient stones of the Centro Storico baked slow and warm and smelled the way they had smelled for centuries, dust and basil and something sweet and something mineral, and underneath it all, the sea, always the sea. Julia sat on the upper terrace of the Posillipo apartment on a Saturday morning in June with coffee and the Gibbon. She was on the 3rd volume, annotating as she went, and the bay spreading impossible in front of her, and she thought, deliberately and with full attention, about the accounting. She had been doing this periodically since January, the accounting. What she had agreed to when she walked into the room at Palazzo Reale, what she had understood, what had changed. She had agreed to a marriage that was a strategic arrangement, that was salvation purchased at the price of herself, that was the last option available to a family with nothing left but its name and one woman willing to carry it. What she had instead, what had emerged from the arrangement, from the unsigned note in a first edition, from the study full of marginalia, from Eduardo from Catania playing cards with her brother all winter, from 3 hours of honest fighting in a hallway and 3 more hours of talking in the history room, was something she had not had a category for in October, and now had a word for. Home. Not the estate where she had grown up. That was home in the sense of origin, the place she carried in her bones, the yellow stone and the narrow streets and the particular smell of the Via Portalba second-hand bookshop on Sunday mornings. This was home in the sense of present tense, the place where she slept and worked and fought and read and practiced piano badly and watched the man she had married become, with each week, more legible to her, and found that what she read there was something she wanted to keep reading. She was not naive. She understood what they were and what they inhabited, the violence of it, the weight of it, the way the world they moved through required decisions that left marks and couldn't be made clean. She had made peace with this, the way she'd made peace with the 4 years of managing the Esposito interests, not by pretending it was other than it was, but by looking at it directly and choosing, with full information, to be here anyway. She heard him behind her. She always heard him now, had learned the specific quality of his footsteps, the rhythm of how he moved through the apartment, which was its own kind of intimacy, this sonic knowledge of a person. He came to stand beside her at the railing. He had coffee too. He looked at the bay. "Luca called," he said. "I know. I saw his message." She had been returning it. "He wants to come to dinner Sunday." "He wants to bring someone," Alessandro said, and there was something in his voice that she recognized as barely contained amusement, which was the closest he came to delighted. She looked at him. He said, "Someone?" "A person from his Portuguese class." A pause. "Apparently a Portuguese woman from his Portuguese class." She felt the laugh come up from her chest before she had managed it. She let it. She had been letting more things through lately. She was learning that the aperture of herself could be wider without being uncontrolled. "He's been in Lisbon 8 months, and he's met someone in his language class," she said. "Yes. That's the most Luca thing that has ever happened." "Completely consistent with his profile," Alessandro agreed. She laughed again. He was smiling, the full version, the one she had been watching emerge across months, the one that transformed his face into something that was not what people in 3 cities described when they described Alessandro Vitelli. Something warmer and more specific, and entirely his. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her. They stood on the terrace with the bay in front of them, and the June light doing what June light did in Naples, and the city making its constant music below. "I want to show you something," he said. She looked up at him. "Now?" "It can wait until you've finished your coffee." She finished her coffee in approximately 90 seconds, which made him make the contained amusement sound that she had catalogued as one of her favourite sounds in the world, without having made a formal decision to do so. He led her inside, up the stairs, to the corridor outside the history room. She'd been in and out of this corridor hundreds of times. He stopped at the wall between the history room and the corridor and pressed something, and a panel she had not noticed opened, and behind it was a smaller room. She stepped inside. Photographs, floor to ceiling the far wall. Not the surveillance photographs, those were impersonal, professional, the records of an operation. These were different. Some were formal, the family, his parents, events she could date from the clothing. But most were casual, candid, the sort you didn't intend to have evidence of yourself. A young Alessandro at what looked like 12, reading on a boat. His mother at a piano she'd never seen before. A summer afternoon somewhere that was not Naples. And among them, on the rightmost panel, her family. She stepped closer. She recognized her grandfather in his 70s from photographs she'd studied for years. Her grandmother, whom she knew only from the oldest pictures. Her father, young, 20 perhaps, laughing at something outside the frame. Her mother, captured from a distance, on what looked like the Via San Gregorio Armeno, turning to look at something, her face mid-expression, entirely alive. And in the lower corner, a photograph she didn't recognize. Her parents together, perhaps 30 years old, walking along the seafront at Mebgelina, her mother's hand in her father's arm, both of them looking at something ahead of them, not the camera. Both of them entirely unself-conscious. She had never seen this photograph. She had never known it existed. "Where did you get this?" she said, and her voice was thick in a way she didn't prevent. "My father knew your grandfather," Alessandro said behind her. He was in the doorway, not intruding, just present. Not as enemies, as contemporaries, men who moved through the same city in the same era. He paused. "My father kept photographs of the people he moved through the world alongside. I found them when he died, in 2021. "Your father is retired," Alessandro said. "Alive, not well. He stepped down when his health changed." A pause. These were in his study. She looked at her parents' faces, her mother's hand on her father's arm, the Mergellina seafront behind them. A moment, caught. "He kept this," she said. "Yes. Why are you showing me?" A pause, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully even in the way of things he was saying directly that he normally said sideways. "Because these are your people, and they deserve to be seen by you. Because this is your history, and it lives here now, and this is your home." Another pause. "And because I want you to see this room, and know that I built this apartment around things that matter to me, and now the things that matter to me include you and yours, and I wanted you to see that." She stood in front of her parents' photograph for a long time. Then she turned and looked at him in the doorway. He was watching her with the steady, depthless attention she had spent months learning to read, and she read it now. Not the assessment of a man calculating an advantage, not the surveillance of a man managing an asset, but the attention of someone who had been alone in a room with the door open for 15 years and had finally, carefully, with a great deal of sustained effort and none of the certainty he brought to everything else, closed the distance. She crossed the room. She took his face in her hands, the way he had taken her face in his hands, and she looked at him directly, and she said, "I love you." Simple, certain, not qualified by the fear, not deferred, not provisional, the full version. He was very still for a moment. Then his hands came to her wrists, encircling them gently, and he said, quietly, and with the particular quality of someone saying a true thing for the first time after holding it a very long time, "I have loved you since before I had any right to." "Since the surveillance," she said. "Before," he said. "The photographs Richie sent. You at the bookshop on Sunday morning. You choosing the table with the sightlines. You managing an impossible situation with the specific dignity of someone who has decided that dignity is the one thing they won't surrender." He paused. "I loved you before I knew what to do with it." She felt tears behind her eyes, which she did not prevent. She had been preventing them for a long time about things that deserved them. "You're going to make me cry in your secret room full of history photographs," she said. "Our room," he said. "Our room," she said. He pulled her in, and she pressed her face against his chest and let the tears come, small and private, and he held her with the same completeness with which he did everything, total, certain, without division. Outside, Naples baked and blazed in June. The bay was impossibly blue. The ancient city breathed its ancient breath, indifferent and magnificent, having seen every kind of love and loss and continuity that human beings could produce in the time they occupied its stones. In the small room full of photographs, two people from old Neapolitan families, families that had survived through adaptation and endurance and the specific ruthlessness of choosing what to keep, held each other in the good light. Everything must change so that everything can stay the same. Julia understood it now. Not as resignation, as something more like grace. The willingness to transform without losing the essential thing, the core that was not negotiable. The name you carried not as a weight, but as a compass. She had carried the Esposito name through 4 years of near ruin and had not let it fall. She had carried it into a room full of wolves and had come out on the other side with something she hadn't expected. She had come out on the other side with this. Sunday dinner that week was 6 people: Julia and Alessandro, Luca and his Portuguese companion, whose name was Inez, who was 24, who was studying architecture and who had apparently learned Italian specifically in order to communicate with Luca's family, which Julia thought was either very calculated or very romantic, and was increasingly unsure of the difference. And her uncle Enzo, who arrived with wine and the expression of a man who had been carrying guilt for 4 years and was only now beginning to let it down. They ate on the terrace because it was June and the evening was warm and the bay was there to be looked at. Luca and Alessandro argued about music again, and resolved the argument by discovering a shared and unreasonable devotion to a specific obscure jazz musician that resulted in 30 minutes of conversation that excluded everyone else at the table, and ended with Alessandro producing from somewhere in the apartment 3 records that Luca had never heard and that were subsequently played on the turntable in the sitting room at a volume that was slightly too loud for the hour. Enzo talked to Julia about her father, who would have loved this terrace, who would have looked at the bay and made the specific sound he made when something was beautiful. A small, exhaled wonder that she had forgotten she remembered until she heard her own voice make it and realized where it came from. Inez and Julia talked about architecture and Naples and the ways cities carried their histories in their bodies, their streets and stones, and the weight of everything that had happened in them. And Julia thought about Lampedusa and about amber and about what it meant to be preserved versus what it meant to be alive. When the dinner was over and people began to leave, Luca and Inez to Luca's new apartment in the Chiaia, Enzo in the car Alessandro had arranged without announcement, Julia stood on the terrace in the warm, late evening and watched Naples do its night thing, all lit up and impossible. Alessandro came to stand beside her. They stood in comfortable silence for a while. "This," she said finally. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the bay with the expression she'd learned was him being happy, Not performed happiness, not the performance of the life he was supposed to have, but the actual thing, careful and private, something he'd learned to let himself have. Alessandro. Yes. The note, she said, in the book. He looked at her. The promise you made, she said, without any conditions attached. Yes, he said. I want to make you one back, she said. Same terms. He was very still. I'm staying, she said. Not because of the arrangement, not because of the name or the business or any of it, because I'm choosing to stay. She paused. That's the promise. No conditions, specifically including the ones I'd have good reason to impose. He looked at her for a long time, with the depthless, still attention that she had learned was not lack of feeling, but its opposite. Feeling contained so carefully because he was the kind of person who protected what was precious to him by holding it in both hands. Julia, he said, and his voice was the quiet, stripped version. Don't do the thing where you're careful about it, she said. Just say yes. Yes, he said. She turned and leaned against the railing and looked at him, and he looked at her, and Naples was behind him, all of it, the centuries and the suffering and the beauty and the violence and the indestructible insistence of a city that had been buried twice by the mountain and rebuilt twice from the rubble. And she thought, this is the city. This is us. This is what we're made of. Old names and old stones and the specific stubbornness of things that refuse to end. He reached for her hand. She gave it to him. Below them, Naples blazed on. In the end, it was not the names or the documentation or the arrangement that lasted. It was the Sunday dinners. The argued margins of a history book. The music from a school in Secondigliano drifting up through a window on a Tuesday afternoon. The sound of a woman getting better at the piano. The particular quality of a man's attention, absolute and unhurried. The bay, every morning. The city, always.